welcome to the Wormhole Podcast, episode 55. I'm Charlie Place, and joining me today is an author whose very first novels were published on the same day. His list of books is substantial. He's written for the screen and the drama won an Emmy, and he is artistic director of the North Cornwall Book Festival. So talking today about 2018's Take Nothing With You. Hello, Patrick Gale.
Hello, Charlie.
And you're talking to me today from your writing room, and it looks absolutely fascinating. Can you tell me about it?
Yes, it's actually an old farm building. It used to be the bull shed, so it's where big business used to live in my father-in-law's day. When I moved to the farm, it was our diesel shed, so it was totally steeped in decades of tractor diesel. And then when we converted it into a writing shed for me, we realised we'd have to take the whole thing down and build it again using the same stones. So it's now got really good insulation. It's, in fact, the warmest place on the property. It's much, much warmer than the house, which is a very drafty old farmhouse. And rather beautifully, it's lined, every inch of it is lined with oak. And along one side is a quotation from my favourite Jane Austen novel, Mansfield Park, which is, "To sit in the shade on a fine day and look upon verdure is the most perfect refreshment." And that's because the shed is actually set in the middle of the garden. So my windows from my desk look out into a kind of jungle at this time of year. I've got great big ginger lilies hitting their paddle-like leaves against the window. It's very atmospheric. Lots of verdure.
It sounds very much like your room of one's own.
Yes, no, it is. And it's curious, actually, it was really quite late in my career that I finally got a dedicated writing space. Until we rebuilt this building for me, I'd got into the habit of writing in armchairs, writing out of doors a lot. I still do write out of doors, but I did it by default when I first moved here. It's such a beautiful place to live, and there's no lack of lovely views, but I did have to perfect the art of keeping dry. So I had a sort of Macintosh square to sit on. And so now I'm nearly 60. I think I need to be kept indoors a bit more.
I'm to have to ask if you can tell us about the farm, and also where did your writing fit into your routine with the farm?
Well, the farm is a typical family, smallish family farm. So it's about 250 workable acres. Right by the sea. It's the westernmost farm in the country. It's right down at Land's End. And we have beef cattle and lots of grass. And we also grow barley and cauliflowers and potatoes. But actually, I'm not anything like as involved as I used to be. For the first 15 years or so of living here, when we were still growing our own potatoes and cauliflowers and not just renting land out for them to be grown on, I would be busy harvesting those, the cauliflowers especially. I had a permanently bad back from heaving great crates of cauliflowers in and out of tractors. So I was very involved. Now my involvement is mainly with the cattle. I really love the cattle. I love working with them. And I discovered I'm actually completely fearless. So I don't mind getting into quite a small pen with a gang of rather bouncy steers and persuading them into the crush to have their worming treatments or whatever. But it fits very nicely with writing. I mean, it's a bit like gardening. It's very good for writers, I think, to have an occupation that gets them away from the desk and out into the fresh air. I have an unlimited supply of fresh air jobs I can volunteer for.
It sounds idyllic from where I am, definitely. So we are talking today about Take Nothing With You. And the book follows a Eustace as he's being treated for cancer. Whilst he's listening to his friend's cello music, he starts to look back at his childhood and the events therein. And his childhood is full of the cello. He is taught how to play, he has his own cello, he goes to music school for a few weeks. The use of music is inspired by your own passion for the cello.
It is, absolutely. And not only the cello, but just music in general. As a small boy, it changed my life in much the way that it does Eustace's. I think I was 7 or 8 when I amazed my parents, who hadn't really noticed I could sing particularly, by landing a choir scholarship to a Church of England choir school, which was a huge relief to them because we'd all been in fee-paying schools, but I was very much the hole in a Durex. I hadn't been budgeted for. And this scholarship paid for everything. So I not only had all my school fees paid for 5 years, but I got to learn 2 instruments free of charge with phenomenally good teachers. So it was a bit like going to a sort of Soviet-style music academy. By the time I left the school at 13, I was convinced I was going to be a professional cellist and or pianist and or singer. I was just in love with performance. And I carried on to Winchester College, the big school across the road, which also had an amazing music department. So I was really very, very lucky indeed. I mean, even though, like Eustace, I did realise a bit later than him, I realised by my late teens that I wasn't going to be a musician. It gave me such a deep and strong grounding in it that it's been a joy for life. And I still play the cello.
What was the realisation, if I may ask?
Oh, brutally, that I wasn't good enough. It's as simple as that. I mean, classical music is just like athletics and ballet in that on one level, it just depends on your physical stamina and prowess and also on the hours you're prepared to put in. And I think I was already beginning to spread myself too thinly by the time I was about 15. I got the drama bug when I was about 13, and I was just in endless plays. And that took away from the time I should have been spending practicing. And you fall back, you fall behind really quickly on an instrument if you don't put in those hours. I know a lot of professional musicians, and it always amuses me that they're kind of late developers emotionally, because during their teens, they were working so obsessively at their given instrument or their singing or whatever, that often they didn't really have an emotional life. And then they go away to music college in their 20s and go completely mad, which is quite funny. So I, in some ways, I was relieved to realise that I would only ever be an amateur. You can still work hard to be professional in your music making, but it takes away that terror of just having to be absolutely the best all the time. Instead of which, of course, I now have the pressure of being a writer all the time, which is not without its pressures.
I like music myself, so I find it quite sad, when it comes to the Eustace, not going to continue with it. But would you say he's living his best life?
Yeah, oh, totally. And it's not that he doesn't continue with it, it's that he doesn't continue with it with the same ambition. I mean, the music making, especially in the UK, has a very fine tradition of big amateur groups. We have an incredible tradition of choral societies in this country and big choirs, really unmatched in the rest of Europe, where there are lots of professional choirs, but they don't necessarily have our very kind of rich singing tradition in that way. And the same is true of instrumental playing. We have a wonderful tradition of amateur orchestras, and I belong to the Penzance Orchestral Society, which has been going about 110 years. And it's very moving, actually, to see all these people coming together every week, and we take it very, very seriously. And we're probably awful, but that doesn't stop us taking it very seriously and doing the best we can. And there's more and more research being published on how incredibly curative and valuable music making is to your brain, especially as you get older, that it fires up synapses in a way that almost no other activity does, and that it helps you recover from strokes and from brain damage and may even stave off dementia. So I always say to anyone I hear saying, oh, I've neglected my cello playing, I always say, well, stop it at once, dust the instrument down. It's never too late to get back on and start learning again.
Did I hear correctly, you had a cello made, you got one made?
I did. This building I'm talking to you from is known as the Richard and Judy Shed, because one of my novel's notes from an exhibition had the great good fortune to get picked for Richard and Judy's television book club, which was like winning the lottery. It got me new readers and so on. And along with that, it brought in enough money, as well as building this building, for me to commission a cello. And I'd always wanted a Baroque cello, which is different in all sorts of ways from a modern cello. So I now have this lovely Baroque instrument, or Baroque style instrument. It's a copy of a Stradivarius cello. And it's a delight to play. I'm very lucky where I live that we have a thriving Baroque scene in the Penzance area. So there's a group of us with these replica Baroque instruments. So we get together and make music. It's a delight.
Oh, no, it sounds incredible. I'm going to have to ask a couple more music questions. What's your favourite piece to play?
Oh, what as a cellist, it would have to be one of the Bach suites, I think, because it's music that doesn't need another player. You do it all on your own. If I'm ever on Desert Island Discs, I suspect my extended luxury would be to ask to take not only my cello, but a copy of the Bach suites with me.
I would hope you could get your cello there. Obviously, I hope you don't have that situation, but as long as you can take your cello there, that's good, yeah. If we move back to Eustace and his life again in the book, were his teachers, you got Carla Gold in his, let's say, his earlier childhood, and then Jean Kerwin a little later on, were they and the school that he goes to, were they based on anyone or any place?
Yes, well, Carla Gold is an amalgam, various cellists from my childhood. She's basically made up, but her kindness and her glamour are definitely based on my first cello teacher, Fiona Smith, and also on an amazing teacher at Winchester College, Elizabeth Wilson, who didn't teach me, but who inspired me. I used to watch her perform and be completely in awe. And Jean Kerwin is based on a real legend of a cello teacher, Jane Cowan, who taught quite a few rather amazing professional cellists like Stephen Isserlis. And she ran a school very, very similar to the one I put in the book, a very eccentric residential cello school in the Scottish borders in a big old country house. And Jane did this. These days, she probably wouldn't be allowed because it was so unregulated. But I didn't get to be a full-time student at the school. I longed to, rather the way Eustace does. But like Eustace, I went on a couple of her intensive holiday courses where, oh God, it was so exciting. A whole group of us would get on the train in London. You'd see all these cellos coming along the platform and realize we were going to the same place. And we'd spend, it was probably only a week, though it felt like a fortnight. I think maybe it was a fortnight, living in this amazing house in the middle of its own park, in the middle of nowhere, just making music all day long. And the thing I really wanted to convey in the book was the intense fizz at that age of suddenly being surrounded by your peers. You didn't have to apologize for being a music nerd because we were all music nerds together. I think this applies to so many disciplines which children might get interested in. It's really enhancing if you can take them away from the rest of their world and just immerse them purely in that world, whether it's chess or ballet or athletics or playing the cello. It normalizes that kind of intensity and can really, you can feel each other improving so fast for doing nothing else. And of course, inevitably, people fall madly in love with each other and have these very intense friendships and relationships, the way musicians do when they have very little time.
You find your people, and it's important, and no matter how short a time it's there for, it affects you lifelong.
Yes. I think it's funny, I hadn't noticed until recently when working on my latest novel, quite a few of my books, insofar as they're about children, are about children finding their tribe. I think it's a very important coming of age thing. And you're very lucky if it happens, because some people don't find their tribe until much later in life. But I think there's the necessary violence most of us have to go through when we realize that our parents and our families aren't enough. We need a tribe, and our tribe is often elsewhere.
Mm-hmm. You've obviously explained why you focused on Eustace's childhood, and we get a short summary of his adulthood, mainly in terms of his romantic relationships, because that's the start of the book. You've got him meeting Theo online. But I have to ask, why this focus? Why was it important to leave that gap between childhood and kind of later mid-adulthood?
Because I think I wanted to show just how long an influence that childhood would have. This is something I've done in books of mine before, that the way childhood damage can be a burden you unwittingly carry on well into adulthood. And sometimes it takes a cathartic experience or a trauma to make you let it go, recognize it and let it go. And what is happening to Eustace in this book is he is facing possible death. He has cancer and he's having treatment for thyroid cancer. And as part of that, it's like a wonderful metaphor that was just handed to me when I heard about this. You are sent into hospital for a residential treatment of radioactive iodine, and you're told in advance you must take nothing with you that you don't mind leaving behind when you leave the hospital. So that struck me as being the perfect metaphor for what Eustace needs to do, for him to have a chance of adult happiness with Theo, assuming he recovers from his cancer treatment. He needs to confront and deal with the damage of the past. And his friend, who is also a cellist, helps him in this because she drops him off at the hospital with a little memory disc full of music, little portable MP3 player thing, full of cello music that will, she knows, get his memory working. And so as the book progresses, adult Eustace in the hospital bed is listening to this music and reliving these intense scenes from his distant childhood, which we do realize contain some very deep, I don't want to give away too much plot, but there is some very deep trauma buried deep within there. His mother in particular does a terrible thing to him, which we gradually realize he has never really dealt with. In a very English way, he has buried it. And in a very English way, he has come to some kind of uneasy accommodation with his mother rather than confronting her.
Well, on that note, I mean, you've got, we won't spoil it, we'll say that there's a shocking few scenes that you were talking about. And there's the lead up to it with a priest and women of the community. I actually thought the priest was going to be the second husband that you'd mentioned earlier in the book. But the religion is both a big slice of the book and kind of also contained, so it's very important, but in a literal sense, when you're reading it, if you look at the words, it seems not so important, if that makes sense. Why did you incorporate it in this way?
Well, this was partly autobiographical. My mother, just like Eustace's mother, nearly died in a car crash. And as part of that process, she lost the power of speech and had to kind of rebuild herself. And she emerged from this physical trauma with a really, really strong Christian faith that my older siblings, who had known her pre-accident better than I had, I suppose, all said this was a character change, that she hadn't been like that before. And she maintained that she had died and come back to life again. And so I borrowed that and gave that experience to Eustace's mother because I thought it was something I'd written about religion before, but I'd never written about it in this very personal way as being like something, like an alien thing that suddenly seemed to infiltrate our house and in some ways come between me and my mother. That religion was suddenly so important to her.
Mm-hmm. Just the way you've written about the parents and the kind of shades of grey constantly, that as a reader, I think you're trying to work out, sometimes you think, oh, okay, so Patrick's saying the dad's okay, and then other times, no, the mum seems, and you're working out things and you're trying to see things from his perspective. Yeah, it's just a really wonderful way you've done it.
Well, very kind. I mean, I wanted to catch that ambivalence, that sense, especially when you're hitting adolescence and everything is changing within you. The polarities within the family can change. And so I wanted Eustace's father especially to go from being a figure of fun to being somebody who is actually desperately unhappy, we realise. And he, again, in a very English way, the father is, we realise, having a slow motion nervous breakdown, and everyone around him is trying to ignore it. This is a novel largely set in the 1970s, and the 70s was a period I remember all too well when we weren't especially good yet at recognising mental illness or dealing with it.
Mm-hmm. To go back to what we were saying about Carla and Jean, is there any literary significance to Naomi's inclusion? She seemed to me a bit like a kind of a Carla Gold for adult Eustace.
Well, I mean, Naomi, she's one of the characters who bridges the two time periods in the book because she is one of Eustace's friends he makes at Jean Kerwin's holiday courses. She, unlike Eustace, becomes a professional cellist. And I rather liked the idea that she would have rediscovered that it's a friendship that they've lost and then rediscovered as adults. That's happened to me a few times, and it's like buried treasure. You suddenly realize you invested all this emotion in somebody in your long ago teens, and that investment is still there waiting for you when you rediscover them, which is rather lovely. So I have one or two friends like Naomi who I've known so long that when we get back in touch or we see each other, it's as if no time has passed at all, which I think as you get older, those friendships become more and more precious to you. There was one of my friends says it's because he knows where the bodies are buried. we have to stay friends because we know far too much. But I always think it's important to write about friendship and celebrate friendship. So many novels are obsessed with erotic love as if that was the only relationship that mattered. But I think friendships are often more enduring and often emotionally in the long term are more rewarding. If you're lucky enough to have a friendship that really sustains and grows with you, it can last all your life, and it needs celebrating.
It was lovely how Naomi is effectively a sister, and you can see the closeness.
Yes. And she's a sister in that way. She has that frankness with him that only a sibling could have. And of course, as an only child, he will have been hungry for that sort of relationship he didn't have in childhood.
Well, you say that. It's a completely different topic in many ways. Why did you effectively set Eustace's childhood in a care home?
That just amused me. I stumbled on Weston-super-Mare. I'd never been there before, and I was invited to give a reading at their library, and I got there far too early, and I spent a very happy afternoon just wandering around the town, getting ever more fascinated, because it's such a strange place. I don't know if you know it, but it's a faded Georgian resort, which is charming in itself, but it's also full of old people's homes and halfway houses for people released out of some long-term psychiatric care and drug rehabilitation centres. So it's a strange nexus of misery and holiday making. And it occurred to me it's a perfect place to set a novel about a profoundly uncomfortable, rather shy, rather overweight little boy. And I thought for the final twist of the knife, if I made his home an old people's home, that would make him even less secure because he doesn't really have a home of his own. He has to share it with all these funny, smelly old people. And but it's ever so slightly an echo of my own very distant childhood because my father was a prison governor. So a far cry from running an old people's home, but it meant that my earliest memories and my siblings' earliest memories are all institutionalized because in those days you lived inside the prison, which is quite strange. You don't have the same sense of home when your home is being shared with about 200 criminals and a bunch of warders and the rest.
Yeah, I know when I started this book, I was taken back to a place called Winter. Obviously, a hospital isn't an institution, but that same sort of thing. So, yeah, it's interesting to hear you saying that there. Towards the beginning of the book and the introduction to Eustace's childhood, you've got the description of the rougher element, which is capitalised from his mother. And later you have Eustace himself having to join, if we say, a bog-standard state school with kids who his mum would likely describe with that description. Yes. What was the significance or importance, I know I'm using that word a lot, of the inclusion of that working class?
I really wanted to play a game with the reader's expectations. And the way the book goes in the first third, you assume that it will be a huge crisis for Eustace if he doesn't get to follow his father's plan and go to the public school in Bristol, Clifton, instead of which it actually turns out to be the making of him. I did a lot of research to this, and I managed to find two people who've both been to comprehensive schools in Weston-super-Mare at just the period when the book is set. And they both said the same thing, that it was a weird combination of fantastic teaching, but also extreme violence. So there were daily gang fights and the like, and yet felt the teachers were really rather wonderful. I think the 70s was a balancing point for a lot of state schools in the UK before they got overwhelmed and became too big or whatever, and teachers were too underpaid, perhaps. I know there was a bit of a brain drain from them later. So I wanted to play with the reader's expectations and then deliver a happy surprise. That's all that was about, really.
No, I mean, I know when I was reading it, I thought, and I hadn't actually at this point considered what his mother had said. That came later in my kind of thinking about the question and things like that.
Well, see, my parents, just like Eustace's, were totally unquestioningly snobbish, really. I mean, they had very fixed ideas of what was right for us as children. And there was, certainly to my father's mind, there was never any question of any of us going to state school. One of my brothers did. One of them rebelled, ended up very happily in the local comprehensive in Winchester. He didn't stay there very long because all he really wanted to do was leave at 16 and become a mechanic, which he did. But I remember that conflict. And I had been so, as a little boy, had been so inculcated in this ethos of private schooling, and a sort of concomitant fear of the children at the state schools, the rougher element, that I remember being rather surprised and actually rather envious of what a lovely time my brother was having at this, on the face of it, rougher school, while I was still stuck in uniform going to my Ponce private school up the road.
Oh, yeah. No, it's just, I was thinking about how you've used the school and what it signifies and everything like that. And, you know, I wasn't at school in the 70s, so maybe this is completely irrelevant what I'm going to say. But it seemed to me that you had focused on kind of, obviously, the goodness of it, and also looking at more of the kind of extreme ideas that people have about things like that. And it just worked so well.
Yeah. I mean, I think Eustace, we see him as an adult right at the start of the book, and I think we realise he has quite good, rounded value system, and that must have come from somewhere. And I think what I wanted to convey is that a lot of it, yes, came from his music training, but a lot of it also came from those friends he made and carried with him through state school. Most obviously, his adored best friend, who is kind of eccentric and tragic by turns, but also that gang of rather formidable rough girls who unexpectedly take him under their wing.
Oh, no, they were fabulous. I like them. What happened to Vernon in your mind?
My mind's eye, oh dear Vernon, in my mind's eye, Vernon is just at the right age to get involved in the dot-com boom. I think Vernon moves to California, does a degree in computer science at Berkeley, and ends up marrying a gorgeous, busty blonde and living in California and making more money than he knows how to spend. Was totally fulfilled and happy.
And still reading Anthony Trollope novels.
I'm undoubtedly still reading Anthony Trollope novels, yes. It's funny, quite often with my novels, I'll end up writing a short story that's tangentially related to it, because there's often an element of the story that I feel isn't quite finished. And I did write a short story very soon after finishing this novel about not Vernon so directly as Vernon's father and his life model, the woman from the cold meat counters at the Wavy Line, who is content to spend afternoons naked in the studio while he paints her. Because that struck me as something I just sketched in the novel, but it was rather a lovely story to take further.
When you do these stories, do you talk about them more widely, these alternatives? And
no, I often keep the alternatives to myself, but I do, as I said, sometimes I find there's like an itch. There's a part of the story that I realise I didn't tell fully and want to take further.
Fair enough. So you have a new book out, Mother's Boy, which is out tomorrow. And you have a reading from this book for us, I believe.
I do. So I will read you the very opening pages of the book because they need no explanation at all. So we begin with a chapter called Atlantic 1941. The ship was under attack and horribly exposed by a clear night and a full moon, until a change in the weather brought fog or cloud, ideally both, All they could do was fight back and hope they were not outnumbered or outgunned. Sometimes an explosion would shake them from so close that Charles almost forgot, in his stifled terror, to feel sick. Sometimes the sounds of their guns going off, or the shouts and stamping boots of their crewmates, would stop long enough to let them hear the piercing cry of someone wounded. Signals came through constantly, so there was not time to do anything but deal with them, and certainly none to talk. Talk was impossible in any case, because Dizzy had his headphones on. These meant that when he swore, as he sometimes did when the ship was especially badly shaken, he did so at the top of his voice, which made Charles jump almost more than the explosions did. Occasionally, the speaker tube's thin peeping sound would summon Charles to receive instructions from the bridge or be asked to make a report on the latest signals to come through. They worked at fever pitch in the hot little office, Dizzy barely turning from his console to flick signals he'd deciphered from Morse across to Charles so that he would decode them into something like English. Dizzy had said once that Morse was enough for him to focus on, and that it would have scrambled his brains if he'd attempted to guess the meanings hidden under the second layer of code. He passed Charles neatly filled out pages from his pad, lines of letters and numbers, always in groups of 4. Charles knew to resist the urge to interpret or anticipate. Accuracy was all. He decoded 4 letters or digits at a time, and only read to check for sense once he had the whole signal down. Sometimes it would be gibberish, and he would know that Dizzy, or whichever wireless telegraphist was on with him, was tired. In this case, he swiftly recognized the code shorthand for a powerful battle cruiser. He knew before getting 2 words further in the missive that this was one he'd need to take to the bridge in person at once, rather than shouting it to a junior officer through the voice tube. He tore the page off his pad, folded it neatly, and tucked it into his pocket to protect it from spray. As he pulled on his duffel coat, Charles tapped Dizzy's shoulder and pointed upwards so he'd know he was heading to the bridge, then stepped out. The cold on deck was a shock after the heat generated by all the electrical kit in the signals office, but it was the painful intensity of the noise that momentarily confused him. The enemy ship they had engaged had approached from the starboard, and they must have swung round to present a narrower target. Charles could see both forward guns blasting shells into the darkness. The weather was changing, thank God. Poor visibility might soon give them cover to slip away to the south. The swell was such that he was amazed the guns could be aimed with any accuracy. Climbing to the bridge, he knew to avoid looking out at the sea for fear of making his sickness worse, but even so, he had to pause a moment before climbing further as a judder of nausea ran through him, making him dry heave over the railings and break out in a sweat the Atlantic wind immediately chilled. There was never mayhem on the bridge, but the sense of group focus was intense. It was known that because of the skipper's slight deafness, he would tolerate no unnecessary talk. Charles saluted and handed over the signal. He waited to attention while it was passed to the skipper, and the skipper read. Often there was a signal to send in reply, but this time the skipper simply shook his head, betraying nothing of the horrors he had just read. "Back to your watch, Causley," he said, then checked Charles's leaving. "Causley? Sir? Did you know anyone on board?" "Yes, sir." "I'm sorry. You know the drill, though. Not a word." Which was when an explosion lit up the night and caused several of them to lose their balance and grab at the nearest handhold. One of the officers swore. "Off you trot," one of them told Charles, as the skipper calmly demanded damage reports.
Thank you. This is about the poet Charles Causley.
It is. That's why I read so long, because I wanted to get to the name Causley. Yes, it's my very cheeky imagining of Causley's childhood and youth and early 20s, and the parallel story of his rather fascinating laundress mother, Laura, and how she raised this genius in very, very straitened circumstances.
Well, you're going to have to explain cheeky there.
Well, cheeky because Charles Causley is in many ways the Cornish poet. He's a national treasure to the Cornish. Many of them feel he should have been poet laureate. He wrote with an authentic Cornish voice, which is quite rare. A lot of poets who are associated with Cornwall, like John Betjeman, they wrote with incomers' voices, not Cornish voices. Charles is authentically Cornish. And he had a rather strange life in that basically the love of his life was his mother. He came home from the war and lived with his mother until she died in the 1970s. And he was never associated with anybody else. So unlike most poets who break hearts and have scandals in their closets, Charles has almost nothing, which is a gift to me, because what I've done is I've invented an emotional life for him, based, it has to be said, on his poems and based on what I could glean from his very cautious, secret diaries he kept as a teenager and right up until about halfway through the war.
So a reconstructed life fully in context.
Yeah, and I hope it's faithful enough. It honours all the known facts, but I make a few things up as well. The most fascinating facts for me was that Charles signed up to the Navy for the Second World War and was trained as a coder, not a code breaker at Bletchley Park, but these were the men and women at the other end of the chain who, thanks to what they discovered at Bletchley Park, were able to put messages in and out of a secondary code to keep them safe from the enemy. And I realized that there's an intimate link between Charles's coding training and his training as a poet. Because when he went away to war, he wasn't a poet, he was a playwright and a pianist. And he comes back from war a poet. So somewhere in the middle, something happened to him which changed the way he expressed himself on paper.
That's absolutely fascinating. And I don't believe it's been said, but you are a patron of the Charles Causley Trust.
I am, yes. I was a director, and then I realised I could be more used to them as a patron, because I'm quite noisy on social media, so I can bang on about Charles Causley. And one of my favourite elements to being patron of the Charles Causley Trust is that I sponsor every year the Charles Causley Young People's Poetry Prizes. These are prizes for 3 different age groups of children, from very small right through to sixth formers, for poems. And it's enormous fun to judge. I'm one of the judges. I work alongside a couple of professional poets on it. It's hugely satisfying, and it goes right to the heart of one of the great things about Causley, who, as well as being an amazing poet, was a really transformative primary school teacher. Rather movingly, he spent most of his working life teaching at the little primary school in Launceston, which he had been to as a boy. And I've met adults who were taught by him, and they all say just nothing but wonderful things about how he got them reading poems, got them writing stories, really woke up their imaginations. So he was one of those truly transformative teachers, a bit like Jane Cowan, my great cello teacher.
No, that's wonderful. I love that you've got an award for the younger children as well.
Yes, well, I think you can never start too young when it comes to creative writing. And I get very depressed at the cumulative effect of the national curriculum on creative writing in schools. It doesn't leave enough room for creativity. And I think most deadening of all is the way the national curriculum has scared teachers away from creativity. They're so worried about getting the children in their care through the relative hoops and ticking the relevant boxes that creativity often gets left out of the mix. And I vividly remember how winning the occasional prize for my writing when I was little made such a difference. If a child wins one of our poetry prizes, they are handed a prize by a real live poet along with a copy of Charles's poetry. And I think that's the sort of experience that can really give a child pause for thought and make them think, oh, maybe I should carry on writing. So here's hoping.
Lovely to hear. Absolutely wonderful. We have Mother's Boy on the 1st of March, I think bears reiterating. Patrick, is there anything else you would like to add in regards to what we've been saying, your books, anything like that?
Gosh, I can't think of anything. My mind is a total blank.
It is a big question, yeah.
Well, we haven't talked about screenwriting at all, or indeed theatre writing. And funny enough, the project I can't wait to get going on, which was delayed by COVID, is a stage adaptation of Take Nothing With You. I'm going to be collaborating with the wonderful Wardrobe Theatre Company in Bristol and backed by Trafalgar Studios in London. So it's a proper grown-up theatre project. And our hope is that we will get together an ensemble of actors, all of whom can play a stringed instrument. So we can have all the music in the book can be live on stage. I think that'll be really electrifying for the audience. I hope it will, if slightly terrifying for the performers.
That sounds absolutely incredible. Really, really quite exciting. Have you any ideas of where this will be staged? Would it be touring?
Yes, it would. No, it would definitely be staged in Bristol and we hope London. And then maybe it will tour. Who knows? I think the young director I'm working with on it is very keen on workshopping. So before I write a word of script, we will have a week of workshops with a bunch of actors and musicians and play. I think it's going to be one of those collaborations where we'll do a lot of game playing and trying ideas on for size. But the book is so full of very physical descriptions of what it's like to hold a cello, for instance, and what it's like to be taught by an adult. There's food for thought there. And we also need to play around with ages as well, because I don't think we can have a bunch of teenagers doing it on stage. I think what we'll probably end up is having adults being their younger selves. We will see. I can't wait. It's been boiling away in my mind for months now. COVID is very frustrating.
No, I love the sound of the concept. I think it sounds absolutely brilliant. It's not experimental, but, going towards different ideas and playing theatre. And yeah, it's brilliant. Sounds great. So, Patrick, it's been absolutely lovely having you here this afternoon, effectively. It will go out in the morning. Yeah, it's been fantastic talking to you about music, which I looked forward to since we arranged this interview, and finding out all the extras that are kind of in the background of your book. You've explained to us more fully in this interview has been absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you, Charlie. It's been a delight.
Links to purchase Take Nothing With You and Mother's Boy are in the episode description. If you have enjoyed today's discussion, do subscribe or follow the podcast on your listening app of choice. It's totally free. The Wormhole Podcast, episode 55, was recorded on the 1st of December 2021 and published on the 28th of February 2022. Music and production by Charlie Place.